This is our 14th annual African American Read-In at the North Campus. The collaboration between student and academic affairs, and again, the long-standing collaboration of Miami Book Fair with Miss Paola Fernandez Rana is one of the best things that we've had to secure our authors.
Good morning, everyone. As we can see, Dr. Harrison had some technical issues. I'm sure she'll be joining us soon, but I want to kick off the program. Thank you, Dr. Rodriguez-Niemer, for your warm welcome to this great event. It really is a staple for the North Campus. It really is a staple to the North Campus, and we've been having a couple of technical issues, but I think we're going to get over it. But nevertheless, thank you. And the African American Read-In has been a signature event that we look forward to every year. And it's so great to see that even during this season of COVID, we could use technology sometimes to help us. And this is one great example. We can use it to host this event and allow for the MDC North Campus students, faculty, and staff with students and faculty from Miami-Dade County Public Schools to join us once again. I want to thank the author, Ms. Rebecca Carroll, for bringing her knowledge and insight to this all-important dialogue that we are having in our country, and not shy away from the conversation of race in our society. It is very important for our students in having this opportunity of such an important, acclaimed author and the passion she has about her African-American roots and how important it was to keep them alive and at the forefront of her life. This is a topic that our nation faces every day, and thanks to Ms. Carroll and our friends at the Miami Book Fair, we're able to bring this presentation to all of you. Special thanks to Ms. Paola Rana Fernandez, Ms. Lisette Mendez, and Ms. Delia Lopez for always being great supporters of the African American Read-In year after year. Also, I want to thank the African American Read-In Committee as a whole for their fantastic work, and our North Campus Media Services team that always does a fantastic job in every one of our events. And without further ado, I would like to introduce our North Campus Student Government Representative, Mr. Shamir Robinson, that will conduct a formal introduction for Ms. Rebecca Carroll. Mr. Robinson serves as the Secretary of the Student Government Association here at the North Campus and is a member of our TRIO Student Support Services. He is a second-year student pursuing a pathway to biology. Mr. Robinson is a 19-year-old that aspires to be the first professional dancer and doctor of osteopathic medicine. He enjoys volunteering at his church and dancing for the Lord. He spends a lot of time on campus getting to know his fellow student peers through study groups in the library, the student government office, and student life. He has a passion for giving back to others through encouragement and activism. And now I will turn over the camera to Mr. Robinson, and once again, thank you everyone for participating in today's event.
Thank you, President Vasquez. Rebecca Carroll is a writer, creative consultant, editor-at-large, radio producer, and host of the podcast Come Through with Rebecca Carroll. 15 essential conversations about race in the pivotal year for America. She is a producer of special projects at WNYC, broadcasting communications, as well as the editor of collections including Sugar in the Raw, Voices of Young Black Girls in America, and Saving the Race. Conversations on Dubois from a young Black girl in America, Saving the Race. Conversation on Dubois from a collective memoir of schools. She is a producer of podcasts on gentrification in Brooklyn titled There Goes the Neighborhood. Most recently, she was a culture critic at WNYC and a critic at large for the Los Angeles Times. Her writing has been published widely, and she is the author of several books about race in America, including the award-winning Sugar in the Raw, Voices of Young Black Girls in America. Her memoir, Surviving the White Gaze, has been optioned by MGM Studios and Killer Films with Rebecca attached to adapt for TV. Her memoir, Surviving the White Gaze, recounts for a painful struggle to overcome a completely white childhood in order to forge her identity as a Black woman in America. Critics explain her memoir, Surviving the White Gaze, as a timely examination of racism and racial identity in America today and the extraordinarily moving portrait of resilience. It is an honor that I introduce Ms. Rebecca Carroll.
Thank you. So I want to take this opportunity to talk with you all today about becoming, because My book is about surviving, but it's also about becoming who I am as a Black woman today. There were numerous times throughout my life when I might have written a memoir. Maybe even when I was a very small child. When I was 6 or 7 years old, I wrote my first autobiographical essay, which started with, "My name is Rebecca Ann Carroll. I am a Black child." As I talk with you, I'm also going to read short passages from the book of when I might have considered writing my memoir, or rather places that I began to weave the thread of my racial identity into my sense of self. Here is that passage from my very early childhood. This is after I started my dance classes with a Black dance teacher. She appeared suddenly like a stencil cutout in the left corner of my eye, a one-dimensional dark silhouette bending and arching without a face, an abstract image gradually taking the shape of a head attached to a long giraffe-like neck and body. This inky-colored figure from afar didn't look like anything or anyone in the books I read, the dolls I played with, the people in my school, or the people in my family, and yet there was something familiar about her. It felt momentarily like being in a fog. Soon I could make out the tight curls of her afro, like tiny black jewels embedded in an even blacker crown. My ballet teacher was Black, the first Black person I had ever seen in real life. Was she real? My relationship with Mrs. Rowland inspired me in part to write my very first essay. I found a yellow piece of paper and a pencil in the drawing supply closet in our living room. And I wrote, "My name is Rebecca Ann Carroll. I am a Black child." Obviously, it would have been silly and probably not likely for me to have written a memoir when I was 6 years old, but I did start thinking about identity very, very early on because I had to, because I could see the way in which adults, white adults, had sort of made it their business to other me and define who I was or what I was. And I needed to find a way to wrest that power for myself. And it felt like it took forever and a very circuitous route to what feels like home and freedom and wholeness of self. But if I've learned nothing from writing this memoir, it's that you have to be ready, not just in terms of the actual craft of writing, but in terms of the emotional fortitude and foundation, the ability to lift myself up and out of trauma and judgment and to undo the internalized racism that I experienced in the 5th grade when my white teacher told me I was very pretty for a Black girl. That was the out-facing racism. But the racism that I quietly internalized well into my 20s was what she said after that, which is that most Black girls are not pretty at all. They're very ugly. Because it wasn't just that she had demoralized me and basically told me that acceptably pretty in the context of white standard of beauty, that I could possibly fit into that if she decided. But mostly the people I came from and represented were almost never deemed beautiful. My legacy of Black girl was ugly. Let's take a moment to remember, too, that in the context of America, Black girls are more adultified, exotified, marginalized than their white girl peers. Middle school was kind of a nightmare for me. It may have been for many of you as well. But I was in a very moneyed, all-white town where class reared its ugly head It was the first time that I realized the ways in which classism perpetuates racism. Being rich meant being better, and being better meant being white. And within that, an overarching privilege, casual degradation, and the arbitrary assignment of cultural value. In the 6th grade breakdancing group, it was wild because breakdancing in the 80s was huge, big enough so that it actually came to my small rural town to perform for an assembly. And I was so enthralled, and it was almost like being in a trance as I was watching these Black boys perform. And then I got caught by a peer, a white boy who I had a crush on, a popular boy named Ryan, who caught me watching these boys. He caught me feeling close to them, caught me trying to build a connection to them. And I suddenly felt this combination of guilt and bereftness and desperation. Here's that passage. I immediately understood that an open display of solidarity with Blackness would make me less viable, less valuable as a member of the popular clique. I couldn't gamble with the popularity I'd effectively banked for the sake of this Black boy who was only going to return to whatever faraway city where Black people lived, never to be seen again. Ryan pushed back, and we all left the gym in a highly engineered herd of homogeneity. I turned back one last time to see the boy I'd betrayed. He shook his head, his face conveying what he'd known all along, that I was a sellout. There was no way to escape this assessment as a Black girl, the Black girl, outside of the context of desire and boys and beauty and the girls who were pretty. Popularity, like capitalism, is a system that only works if someone else is held down. And people who are in that system of popularity and self-importance, whiteness, both adults and children, will not hesitate to keep their foot on your neck if that means assuring their place in that system. In high school, there was another white boy, this one named Nate, who I was friends with, very good friends with, and we had decided to go to the prom together as friends. Here's a passage from that era. Our inner circle of friends was small, so people found out pretty quickly that Nate and I had decided to go to the prom together. The next day when I walked into school, I was immediately besieged by concerned friends. Had I heard? They asked. Heard what? Nate's father forbid him to take you to the prom, Mark said. Forbid him? I thought. It's the prom. Whose parents forbid their child from going to the prom? What? Why? That I didn't immediately connect the dots and answer my own question is evidence that I was either delusional or hopeful regarding my viability and worth among my white peers, especially since Nate's father, Mr. James, was my U.S. history teacher and had not so subtly indicated a few weeks prior that I was dumb because I'm Black. It had been during a class when he was teaching us about the American economy, and Mr. James said something about how smart the early Southern settlers had been. I asked if he thought having slaves had made the settlers smart. You don't even know what you're talking about, he snapped back at me. You see, Black people don't think right, and that's your problem. The next time I saw a Black breakdancing group perform, I was 15, and I was ready this time. It was during the summer, and I had gone to a seacoast town about an hour and a half from where I grew up, and there was a small Black population there, and breakdancing was still huge, and I became friendly with some of these boys in the group, and it sparked for me the first time that I really thought about my own Black father in the context of these Black boys. And I began to wonder what he sounded like and how he would talk to me and how he might guide or coach me to find my identity and to find my safety in Blackness. And this one boy who I met was named Ice Cube prior to NWA, an actual Ice Cube. As soon as I heard Cube speak, I wondered for the first time what my birth father's voice might sound like. How would it sound to hear him say my name? Would he have the same cadence as Cube? Was my birth father's manner of speaking fluid or halting? Was his meter casual or pointed, separated by quiet pauses or sprinkled throughout the ums or you knows? Would it sound Black like Cube's or Black like mine? Was my voice even Black? There was no one who modeled a Black male voice in my immediate life, no Black male sound that spoke to me with warm affection, a familial melody, until now. Gathering yourself on your own as part of a culture based on community is challenging. But I felt as though my Black ancestors found ways to remind me of that, even if my white adoptive family and white peers could not. And that's the thing about Blackness. As we think about it this Black History Month, about which I feel torn, because I feel like Black history is all the time, year round. And I have my I'm Rooting for Everybody Black mug in honor of Issa Rae. But I do believe that Blackness and Black culture is so deeply rooted in ancestral relationships and memory and strength and endurance. And so even if I had to attend an almost entirely white state school for college, because my parents couldn't afford to send me anywhere else, that is where I met my first Black professor and Black male role model. I sat in the front row for every class and soaked in Elijah's words and wisdom like gospel. He commanded the classroom as he spoke about James Baldwin and Toni Morrison, whose novel Sula became my Bible after I first read it in class. He talked about the power of words and how integral history, all history, but especially Black history, is to the way we use language, the way we write about ourselves and the world around us, how we think about history as we write, he said, is what turns an essay into literature. I wrote about books by Alice Walker, Gwendolyn Brooks, Nella Larson, and Toni Cade. Their words and worlds and the structure and grace across every page felt biblical and made my insides churn and my mind explode. It was like guzzling love, fast and warm and sweet in my throat. Thousands of words would present themselves, breathe and carry ideas and images clear through to the very end of an entire book without mentioning a white character. Zora Neale Hurston's essay, How It Feels to Be Colored Me, resonated so deeply with me, I could hardly believe it. I felt rage that I was only discovering her so long after I'd needed her, which was from the beginning. Sometimes I feel discriminated against, but it does not make me angry, Hurston wrote. It merely astonishes me. How can any deny themselves the pleasure of my company? It's beyond me. I used that quote as the starting point and wrote an essay I didn't know I could write about how I managed to navigate high school experience, my high school experience, without falling into despair. How sometimes, somewhere deep down, I always believed my company was worthwhile, despite the rejection and the racism, and that maybe, just maybe, the white boys who didn't like me that way, and my racist teachers and racist boss at the oil company where I'd worked in high school, and my boss called me the N-word, were missing out on something lovely. They were missing out on me. Oftentimes, in this moment of racial reckoning, whatever that means, and certainly during this month of Black History Month and previous Black History Months, I'm asked often by white people what they should do or read or how they should be better informed or better allies. And I say, not just the anti-racism books, not just the how to be an ally books, but the literature that I just mentioned, Toni Morrison, Alice Walker, Nella Larson, Zora Neale Hurston, all of those pages and characters and plots that exist outside of the white gaze. That's how you learn the value of Blackness, of us, and what we bring, and how we stand in this world. My teacher, that professor that I just talked about, felt like an ancestor to me, a living ancestor, telling me that I would get there. You're gaining steam, he would write on my essays. And I started to think that I would become who I was meant to be. So I ended up transferring and graduating from a different college, which had a larger, more active Black community. And I found chosen family in that community, and graduated with the resolve that I was going to actually find my actual Black family, my birth father, who had last been seen in Boston. This all took place in New England. I grew up in New Hampshire. I went to school in New Hampshire and then later in Western Massachusetts. And then after college, I graduated and moved to Boston to find my birth father. The first time we were scheduled to meet, he didn't show up. But the second time he did. This is why God put me on the earth, Joe said. My birth was Joe. His hands on my shoulder. You are so beautiful. You are alive. We sat down across from each other at the table where I'd been waiting, and a strange wave of grief passed through me. I didn't know what I was mourning. You know, they took you from me, he said, shaken and emotional. Tess and her mother and Roy, they took you, just like slave times. I wanted to keep you. I would have raised you, but they shut me out and stole you away from me. Joe told me that it had felt especially important to be in my life because his own biological mother, Blanche Calloway, jazz singer and older sister to the better-known jazz singer and bandleader Cab Calloway, had no other choice but to give him up at birth so that she could focus on her budding career. It was hard enough for a Black woman to even have a career back then, Joe said. She couldn't have a career and raise a child, too. I don't know who my father was, so she would have been alone, too. I learned that Joe grew up in and out of foster care without any lasting familial bonds or friendships and knew of no other existing biological relatives that he might have. I hope you'll let me see you, he said, and that you'll call me Pops. It was a lot to process, but I felt an unexpected affection swelling inside of me. He wasn't what I thought he'd be or look like. I'd imagined he would, but he was gentle and vulnerable. He showed up and wanted to be in my life. I didn't know how to manage one more parent in my already cramped carousel of parents, but I knew I wanted to try. Sadly, and I'm fast forwarding quite a bit, Joe died before my son could ever meet him. And it's when I had my son that I actually became whole. And I knew it. After Michael Brown was shot and murdered in Ferguson in 2014, my son, Kofi is his name, was 9. I had an epiphany to mark that moment of becoming for me and for us after Kofi asked if he and I would get shot too because we are Black. I explained that yes, there's a chance that some white people might want to shoot us because we are Black, because American history has not been kind to us, and that we, Black folks, and especially young Black boys, are left with the burden of fear that we might be in the wrong place at the wrong time. We were never supposed to be here or to survive, but we are here and we have survived. And you, Kofi, can look to that legacy of survival and resilience and beauty and strength as your own. I said this echoing the same sentiments that inform what has become my life's work, writing and talking about Black culture in America, amplifying Black voices, and holding up the narrative of Black folks both collectively and as individuals. Kofi got out of his chair and came to sit on my lap, his 9-year-old self still small enough, just barely, to curl into my body. And we sat together for a little while without talking. I breathed in the smell of his hair and skin, absorbed the glorious weight of his need for my love, for the safety he found in my arms, for his need for me. It was bittersweet, not just because of the subject matter that had prompted this moment, but also because I thought of my birth father and felt a wave of sadness take over me. The year before, a friend of Joe's had found me online. He and I had lost touch and called to tell me that Joe had died of complications from diabetes and kidney failure, among other things. Joe did not have health insurance or access to proper health care and subsequently did not survive as a Black man in America. And I thought there would be more time. But now Kofi will never meet or know his Black birth grandfather, and that will always be one of my deepest regrets. But he does have me, and I have him, and I survived the white gaze to become a Black woman in America. I would love to hear questions, if you have them. I see that people are still arriving. I generally don't give, sort of formal talks or speeches or lectures about Blackness, in part because I think that the work I do in producing audio, live events when we were in the before time, is a better way, a sort of immersion, as opposed to me talking at you. And so if I could encourage you to ask questions that would spark a conversation and that will help you in your own becoming, if that makes sense. I'm sure that many of you are at different places in your lives, but I would love to hear from you. Okay, here's a question. How did you feel becoming a mom after what you had experienced? It was, I have to tell you, it blew my mind. It literally blew my mind. I was not prepared for how close I would feel, how connected I would feel to my son. And I think it's one of the reasons that I didn't have a second. I thought I would have at least 2, but I had just one because took me 3 years to really fully absorb how important this boy was to me and this family that I made of my body. Here's another question. How did you react? How did you react when George Floyd and Michael Brown's cases happened? Well, as I wrote in the book, when Michael Brown was shot, it was a hugely pivotal moment for me as a writer, as a mother, as a Black woman, as a Black person, as a member of creating Black history, as someone who's creating Black history as we speak. You know, we marched. I wrote about it. I was a columnist at the time, and I wrote several pieces about it. And then, you know, as several of these cases have happened, some are more magnified, some get more media attention, but, you know, George Floyd and Michael Brown are as you know, valuable as Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor, and, you know, so many other young Black lives that were murdered and taken. And so how I react, you know, I write about it, I talk with my son, I talk with my family, and I think more than anything else, I do what I think is the appropriate response, is that I grieve and I mourn, and I take that in as another moment in this contemporary landscape where we're really still trying to dig our way out of the violence and the lasting repercussions of systemic racism. Okay. How did you know you were whole when your son was born? Is it a feeling or just knowing? That's a great question. It's just a feeling, and that's why it truly blew my mind. I know I've said that now 3 times, but it was like nothing I'd ever felt, and I knew that. You know, I think it's partly because I mean, hugely partly because I'm adopted, and because he became the first family of my flesh and blood. Also, you know, it's just an overwhelming experience to grow a person in your body and then have them come out and live outside of your body. I hate to be one of those people who are like, it's so magical, but it's pretty magical. How did colorism within Black race affect your own identity and self-acceptance as a Black woman? I assume you're asking the question because you are viewing me as light-skinned, which I suppose I am. Medium, I would say. I am quite sure that it was an issue in ways that I didn't hear about. I just wasn't around enough Black folks growing up. And then, you know, sort of when later in college, you know, I started a Black student union, and then I had Black friends of several different hues, and we certainly talked about it. We talked about it in media and television, and how light-skinned Black women are cast more than dark-skinned Black women. And certainly I've always talked about it in a political context. But in terms of my own experience, because I was the only one as a child, you know, there wasn't like I think that my 5th grade teacher, probably what she meant when she said you're very pretty for a Black girl was that you're light-skinned, so, you know, that gives you an edge. She didn't actually say that, but in retrospect, I imagine that's what she meant. Did your adoptive parents ever have a similar conversation with you and your race? No. And that's let me say the whole question. Did your adoptive parents ever have a similar conversation with you and your race like you did with your son about Michael Brown? No, they did not. And that is a bone of contention. And that is what, I mean, I write about it in the book. I've written about it in several op-eds and essays. You know, white adoptive parents of Black children need to have those conversations, not least of all because of safety, but for their own knowledge of the way in which Black folks, Black boys particularly, are profiled by the police. It's just ridiculous to not be aware of that. For anybody to be aware of that, but particularly white adoptive parents of Black children. What is one effect that you hope your book is the cause of? What is one effect? I do hope it changes the way that young Black girls in any environment, but certainly in mostly white environments, will change the way they think about themselves. I hope that white adoptive parents will think differently about the way that they raise their Black children, and also think more clearly and deliberately about motivations behind adopting. I think that transracial adoption is really is problematic, not leastly because of the sort of parallel in terms of colonization and colonistic thinking, as in white savior, as in, your life will be better because we are going to give you a better life than you would have with Black parents or in a Black environment or family. So I hope that as with anything and everything that I do and write, I hope that it will spark conversation, that it will encourage people to think more deeply and engage more deeply with issues surrounding race, particularly different ways in which Black lives matter, and take even one kernel of something in the book and have a conversation that maybe feels really, really difficult, because we talk a lot about having difficult conversations, but then we don't have them. We say, oh, this is a really hard conversation to have about race, so let's just say it's a hard conversation to have and then move on. But in fact, you have to feel something in order to learn something. And oftentimes what you feel is not going to feel good, particularly for white folks, which is that there is a complicity that is unintentional, but is nevertheless complicity. And I think to grow, to heal, there has to be a kind of misery, a kind of pain that acknowledges that complicity. Do you believe we can fix the systemic imbalance for Blacks in America? Whew, well, I sure hope so. I spend a lot of time trying to do that. I hope so. I think maybe not in my lifetime, but I certainly hope in my son's lifetime. Speaking of, I think that it in this current election, this most recent presidential election, a lot has been said about laws and legislature, and that is important in terms of moving towards equity and equality, racial equity and equality. But you also have to, as I just said, you have to change the way people feel about things and the way people think about things. And that is the harder thing, because, it's passed on, it's taught from generation to generation, and it's deeply, deeply internalized. So, I mean, the short answer is yes, I think so. The longer answer is I think it's incredibly difficult work, and it will continue for a long time to come. Do you believe your son is growing up in a better world now since there is more awareness on the issues people of color face? I do. I do. I also feel like he is growing up in a better world because he's growing up in this family, and because I'm his mother. And his father is, also, we're deeply engaged with the world around us, and I think that that's the responsibility of any parent, but particularly Black families. So yes, I do feel hopeful about the world that he's growing up in. There are all sorts of other issues like climate change that are all of a piece in terms of the direction this country and this world is going. But in the immediacy, COVID notwithstanding, everything else, I think that he is in a good place. Future is hopeful. I feel optimistic about his future. Do you think society can someday be colorblind? I hope that society will never be colorblind. The second part of that question is this a utopian fantasy? I think it's actually, it's not a fantasy. It's a sort of negative delusion, and it's a way to erase race and culture and color, which is a deep source of pride for me, and lots of folks, and I encourage that in my son. So I don't think colorblind is the goal. I think the goal is to broaden our minds, so that we can see color as something that we don't have to look away from, as something that we don't have to make blind, that we can embrace, that we can enjoy and appreciate and marvel at. So I don't see it as a fantasy goal at all. What should I tell my 17-year-old son about the way young Black people are murdered in the USA? What can he do to protect himself, to value himself? That is an excellent question. My son is 15 now, and as I wrote in the book, Black folks were not meant to be here, and we were not just brought here; we were forced here, and then we built the country. I think that a strong sense of pride, self-awareness, personal value, familial ties, what he can do to protect himself. I wish I knew, because you see what is happening. We see what is happening. In some ways I feel very, it's not a silver lining per se, but the pandemic and the quarantine, at least my son is here with me all the time. There's something really, that I feel really grateful for about that, because at this age, out in the world, as soon as he leaves the house, it's terrifying on some level, but in fear, you can't live terrified. You have to be, you have to. I think there isn't one way to talk with our children about this. I think you have to get a sense of who this person is, who your child is, and how they feel comfortable in the world, how they want to protect themselves, and be open and available to different avenues and different ways to have the conversation, not just don't go outside, don't talk back to police, don't do this, don't do that, because we know that those haven't worked. So I think that there are ways that have yet to be created for us to protect ourselves, and that we right now in this moment have an opportunity to sort of reset after 4 years of a white supremacist administration and a white supremacist president. I think we have an opportunity, a small crack in the window, to reset, and that involves all of us, and that involves conversations specifically about how young Black folks are being murdered. And so I would say engage, and engage. It seems like a lot of influential figures, good, bad, in your life were teachers. As an educator in your own way, aside from the literature, what do you believe would help educators and students bridge those cultural gaps? So I think it's really important. I mean, I'm assuming that you mean by educational cultural gaps, like if there are white teachers teaching Black and brown students. I think I'm a firm believer in experiential expertise on the issue of race. And so if you are a white teacher teaching Black and brown kids, you have to defer to their expertise, their experience. to not tell them who they are, to let them tell you who they are and what their experiences are, and then weave that into the way that you teach. Because it's not always in the books. It's, again, and I know I say this a lot, but it's about engaging, and it's about really absorbing. I mean, you think about the way in which systemic racism has been internalized, not just by individuals, but by the population of the country. So that internalization not only has to be undone, but we have to internalize another way of thinking. So we get that from the people who have experienced most poignantly and pointedly racism. So I think it's up to white teachers, white people, white parents to defer, but listen, and begin to internalize a different way of thinking about race and culture. Do you feel that Black individuals are more readily shot by the police because of their race? Yes. I have heard this a lot, but when I look at the numbers, things do not add up. I'm asking this because I want to understand different perspectives. That's tricky because I don't have statistics at the ready. I see you've sent a link, but I don't think that it makes sense for me to open that link and read that when other people can't see it. I mean, I don't have a statistic ready to offer. And I think you could go down a couple of different roads with that. What we see, what goes viral, is violence against Black bodies. And that has been the case since the hosing and the dogs and the tear gas of the civil rights and prior, and lynching. I mean, all the way back to lynching. It's a spectacle. Violence against Black bodies is a spectacle. So whether or not, statistically speaking, police shoot Black people more, I don't know that that's actually the point. I think more to the point is that when Black bodies are killed or maimed or murdered, it becomes a spectacle in America. That's the insidiousness of racism. How do you see perspectives of Thomas Sowell, Shelby Steele, Jason Raleigh, John McWhorter? Well, they're not. I think what the question is what do I think about conservative Black folks? I think they're fine. I don't spend a lot of time thinking about Shelby Steele and John McWhorter. I think that's I think there are smart Black conservative people. I guess I feel like, if you're intellectually honest, then I respect you. And if you are not, then I don't. That's my pat answer there. You mentioned your early introduction to Toni Morrison and other writers. How important is it that these authors are introduced to children early on in a way to offer literature that speaks directly to the Black experience without the typical influences that writers feel the need to embrace when telling their stories? I think that the earlier kids are introduced to Black literature, the better. And Toni Morrison, who is one of the greatest masters of writing in the history of America. Every single one of her books gives us a gift of pain and joy and emotion and intellect and language. She's such a master with language. So I think not even just because of what her books provide in terms of Black folks and a Black experience, but just because she's just such a phenomenal writer. People forget that. It's like, oh, I should read these Black books, so I should learn about Blackness. But read Toni Morrison and learn about writing and Blackness, but writing too. it almost feels as though our Black children are being robbed of their childhood, having to explain to them situations like shootings, etc., at such an early age is terrible thoughts. I guess I feel that it's real, and that there are terrible things that happen. I mean, real life is not, I mean, this sounds so cliche, but real life has some very terrible parts of it. Now, telling your child about the reality of terrible things doesn't have to be terrible across the board. Learning about history, what's happening with police and profiling, legacy of violence, but also joy and I mean, every single thing in our culture at large in America, music, literature, art, church, it all much of it the origins can be found in Black culture and Blackness, and that's pretty mighty. That's pretty extraordinary. I think of that as sort of outweighing, in many ways, the terrible things and situations that we have to explain to our Black children. I think we have time for one more question.
Yes, we do. We have one more.
Okay. Where is it?
Ariana?
Wild Crimes.
Is that the one? That was it.
While crimes are mostly reported to be done by Black individuals, that's not true. And most of the shooting death by police are targeting, well, I'm not sure I understand that question, but or that preface, but the question is, do you feel that the white community should raise their voice against this or work on other aspects? I feel like white people have a lot of doing and undoing to do. If raising their voice against wrongdoing is what works, then yes. If there are other ways to contribute to equality, great. But yes, I mean, I feel like white people should do, quote unquote, the work as much as anybody else, as much as we all should.
Rebecca, we would have loved to have you. I just finished texting someone, said this is the type of conversation you want to pull up with a cup of tea, and then just so inviting and approachable. And we thank you for sharing your story, your work, the golden nuggets, and moving the needle today to pick up this important conversation, not only in our classrooms, in our homes, in our communities. So thank you so much for that. And so we definitely will be inviting you back if you would have us and you would come back with us. We'd love to have
I hope
you.
in real life, I would love to come down there and get some sun, especially today up here in this cold snow.
Yeah. So thank you again, and for the many folks that did participate, thank you for your questions. Thank you for joining us. We have high schools, we have the community, we have so many different connections, and I am really happy that they were able to hear you. Like I said, you have moved the needle today in just helping us continue to move forward, to begin and to continue to have these discussions. They're very important for us in our community, in our future. So with that said,
thanks so much for having me.
We welcome. We will be closing now, and so thank you again, and here we end. Sadly. Thank you.